Well, hello and welcome to another Music Ally Focus with me, Music Ally's editor, Joe Sparrow. And in this episode, we're joined by Deborah Mannis-Gardner of DMG Clearances, who has cleared samples for, deep intake of breath, Wu Tang Clan, Drake, Beyoncé, Kendrick Lamar, Common, Eminem, and the groundbreaking musical Hamilton, amongst hundreds of others. She's just helped pull off something that many thought may never happen, getting the many samples on De La Soul's groundbreaking albums cleared so that they can finally appear on streaming services. We ask her how you go about getting people to say yes to letting artists use bits of their songs. Now, each Music Ally Focus episode analyzes one meaningful music business story at a time, and so this podcast is going to be fairly quick. It'll be 40 times as long as the shortest song to ever enter the Billboard Hot 100, which, fact fans, was Pen, Pineapple, Apple Pen in 2016 by Kazuhito Kosaka, aka Pico Taro, and the song was a mere 45 seconds long. Now, talking of taking short pieces of songs and making them successful, sampling has been the backbone of a number of modern music styles from house to hip-hop for decades now. After De La Soul's master recordings were acquired by Reservoir, Deborah was brought in to clear every sample on their classic albums, resulting in something previously, it was thought, unlikely, and the band's albums will soon appear on streaming services everywhere. Deborah also recently cleared the samples for the albums Honestly Nevermind by Drake and God Did by DJ Khaled, and on the hip-hop mixtapes Lil Wayne's No Ceilings and Nicki Minaj's Beam Me Up Scotty. So I wanted to know how she went about it, how she got into the business of clearing samples, and how you convince people to say yes. It's worth noting we spoke only a day after the tragic news of the death of De La Soul's Dave Jolicoeur, aka Trugoy, emerged. Let's go over to that conversation with Deborah now. So really happy to be joined by Deborah Mannis-Gardner. First of all, can you just describe your background and explain how you ended up specializing in clearing samples for high-profile artists? Because you've done this for a bunch of big artists, haven't you?
Yeah, so I started doing sample clearances back in 1990 for another company that's not even around anymore, when there really weren't any rules or structure for sample clearances. It was a genre of music that I became interested in. I had some British flatmates that turned me on to hip hop and rap. I was punk rock, and I actually felt a connection to the music. So I've been doing this, with EPMD. I did work with De La Soul in the beginning when they were on Tommy Boy Records, Shinehead, and then this just evolved and continued into working with bigger and greater artists, mostly the East Coast stuff, LL Cool J's 14 Shots to the Dome. I worked closely with Marley Marl, Diggable Planets. Then I went in-house at RCA Records when Joe Galante was president and Skip Miller was head of A&R. And that was during the heyday of Wu Tang Clan, Loud Records, Levert, SWV. I mean, RCA was in the forefront of hip-hop and rap music. And I was there kind of like the angel of death. I was there telling them what they could or could not do. So, but I didn't really like working in a corporate setting. I didn't like that my window didn't open. So when Bob Jameson became president, I asked if I could leave, but I would still continue doing all their sample clearances. And so January 1st, 1996, I opened up the doors of DMG when it was a single female-owned business. And now we have 13 people under my umbrella of DMG.
Wow, fantastic. And you've just named your sort of work through the golden age of hip-hop there. And, that sounds like exciting times. You've obviously initiated some sort of sample-based beefs with some of the main producers in hip-hop during that time. But what are generally, and as before we dig into your recent work with De La Soul, what are the biggest hurdles when you're clearing samples, first of all, for such high-profile artists, but also perhaps of high-profile songs as well?
I always tell people your first obstacle is availability, and then your second obstacle is cost. So when we talk about availability, there are some writers or artists or copyright holders that do not want to be sampled. We know that with Anita Baker. We know that Rod Temperton, although he did clear one sample for Aaliyah, he took 100% of the publishing and a six-figure fee. And his widow has never allowed anything since his passing, and nothing further ever came besides that one use. So that's what I mean by availability being your biggest and first obstacle. And then your second obstacle is cost. Is it cost prohibitive? Is it a fair quote that's been given to you? So even if when I'm working with my large artists like Eminem or Jay-Z or Drake, DJ Khaled, the quote that the copyright holder gives me on behalf of my client has to reflect the use. It shouldn't just be like, ka-ching, payday, it's a big artist. And I get very defensive because conversely, I work with very small artists, independents, up and coming. IDK was a client of DMG's before IDK was signed to Warner Brothers and has like really blown up. So we also fight as much for the smaller artists to make sure that those sample quotes mirror what was used.
Obviously, the creative process of these producers, I'm thinking, let's say the RZA or whoever, they go out and they produce a song. They don't come and check if a sample is clearable before they make it. They're in the flow and they're making it in that moment. So what sort of happens then if you reach a sort of stalemate and there's a great song, there's a sample work that works really, really well, but either the clearance is too expensive or it's not possible? How does that sort of impinge on the creative process then?
I mean, it does happen. I mean, when Kendrick Lamar had sampled Prince and when he was still alive and there was a relationship and Prince loved the song, but he's like, hey, man, I can't do it. It's, I've taken this position that I don't want people to sample my material. It's a very positive conversation that they had. And so I think artist to artist, there is respect when someone says, hey, I just can't approve it or I don't want to, or now you're dealing with a lot of estates. So there's a lot of stuff. But you're right. I mean, because sampling is it's an art. It's so creative. And so you don't want to stifle a producer and what they're doing. So I have a variety of clients. DJ Khaled will reach out to me when he's got an idea. And I'll be like, when we went to clear Eric Clapton, I'm like, yeah, I've never done it before. I want to try. I want to make it happen. It was such a great use. And Eric Clapton loved it. So it was really a very positive experience. But then there are other instances where I'm like, hey, it'll never clear. And it could turn into a very horrible situation, which is, the Tracy Chapman situation, where we advised the client it wasn't going to get approved. It did get denied. And unfortunately, it turned into a very personal, emotional battle between the two parties. So when other people, I sleep with my phone. So sometimes I'll say to people, if you're in the studio and you have an idea, text me and ask me so I can let you know, yeah, it's a problem. No, it's not. Yes, we can clear it in 24 hours. No, it's going to take 8 months. So it's really me and my team communicating with the producers, managers, attorneys, and artists to make sure that we can work as a group to get over the finish line. I mean, I never say it's DMG that makes the sample get cleared. It's a team of people that work together to get that final artistic product out. Because when you're looking at an artist, you're looking at LL Cool J, he's got a manager, he's got an attorney, he's got his record label, he's got his publisher, and he's got his producers. So everyone's a team, and then clearance agent. So we're a team making sure that his product gets out there and he's happy with that end product and the producer's happy. It's all teamwork. All that matters is we can get over that finish line with the end product and everyone's happy with it.
And fascinating that actually you're in the workflow there as well. Being able to feed back on sample ideas as part of the process. Let's talk about your work, with this recent work with De La Soul then. Obviously, really a landmark example of something happening with sampling. You've cleared samples for all their landmark albums, which are about to be finally released onto streaming platforms. They've been available in physical form for obviously a long time, but not on streaming. First of all, you mentioned that you'd sort of worked with them when they were on Tommy Boy in the original days. So can you sort of just describe your background with De La Soul, perhaps then, and then how that differed to what you've done with them recently?
So my life with them has been in and out of their lives. So there's this amazing woman by the name of Michelle Baer. She actually was in-house employee at Tommy Boy Records. And then she went out on her own. And then she used to also handle a lot of stuff for Tommy Boy. So the very beginning, Tom Silverman handled a lot of stuff themselves because remember, back in the day, we didn't necessarily have rules. There were handshakes. We did buyouts. It was like who you knew, favors, that kind of thing. Yeah. DMG got involved. It wasn't on the first album. It was a later album while they were under Tommy Boy Records to help secure the clearances of their samples. There was a history, Tommy Boy owning the masters, selling the masters, getting the masters back, selling them, back and forth kind of thing. DMG got involved again with Tommy Boy Records when they were trying to re-clear the uncleared samples not that long ago. But we were running into issues because the copyright holders were fans of De La Soul. And they're like, well, De La Soul doesn't look like they're happy with Tommy Boy, so we really don't want to participate in this, or we want all this back payment kind of thing. So it wasn't going anywhere. And so we kind of I stepped back also, like, we need to respect the artist and what they want to do. When obviously came to light with Tommy selling it to Reservoir and Reservoir giving it back to the guys and being involved, I reached out to Reservoir simultaneously as they reached out to me. And I said, I want to help. I want to be a consultant. I want to guide them. I want to be advice. I want to make sure that historically their music gets out there to this generation that didn't have the opportunities that we had. They are hip hop. I know everyone's making a big deal. It's the 50th anniversary of hip hop. Well, why don't we do a 25th anniversary? I mean, hip hop's been around for a while. We're finally getting recognized for an incredible genre of music. It is an honor and a privilege that I was even involved in making sure that this material could get back out there and can be used in films and can be used in TV and is going to be available to purchase and to stream and everything. So my involvement is just a fan who happens to have skills in doing sample clearances and had the opportunity to be part of this history.
I mean, these, we're talking about, if we focus, I mean, there's a lot of attention on the first album or two albums because these ones are sort of seeing the light of day on streaming for the first time. And of course, we are talking here about the first use of them digitally like this. But of course, these are really, really landmark albums, beautiful albums. And like you say, it's a really exciting time to get these albums out to a new generation. And of course, there was a lot of sort of quite complicated, knotty problems that had stopped them being on streaming for a very long time, as you intimated there. So when you got involved with clearing these samples and sorting all this out recently, what were the challenges that you expected, and what was that process like of clearing all these samples to make it happen?
I think there was concern by Reservoir and the band, like, oh my God, what's going to happen? How are people going to respond to this? I said, I want to approach people by saying, you are part of history. And I know a mistake was made. They were not necessarily given the proper guidance. Things were done differently back then. But please be part of this historical event of getting this material out there so you can earn the revenue that moving forward. And no one denied us. Everyone came to the table and said, well, what do we do? How do we get over this? How do we cross this bridge? How do we make it happen? I am so grateful from the major publishers and major record labels to the boutique and smaller companies coming together to help this historical event happen. De La Soul isn't just an amazing band and representing hip hop and rap. The technique and style of how they sampled. And that was a very distinct sound back then. When I did Common's first album, he had like 8 or 10 samples on a song. So, and Redman, poor Reggie, at his first album, he walked away with almost zero publishing because he had like 6, 7, 8 samples in a song. It was a style. It was a technique. It was brilliant. You come up with an album now and try to have 8 samples and still have publishing left over. Not an easy thing to do. So there's so many levels of excitement, what they did, how they did it, their creative aspect of it, and the fact that everyone came to the table and was willing to do a deal.
So with those negotiations then, because obviously, like you say, it's great that people recognized, that their song or their piece of song is part of this other historical recording, and they're willing to get it released again. And obviously there's financial incentive there as well, but I can see how that comes from a place of artistry. Is there, when you go into those kind of negotiations, as you say, like, these are songs with lots and lots of samples per track, and obviously you're kind of, one of the things you want to do there is be able to sort of get those negotiations to a point where everybody's making money, so that it works for everybody. How do those conversations pan out then? Because, do you sort of pitch it in a way of saying, look, if you allow this to happen for a sort of reduced fee or a slightly lower fee than you want, you're also opening the window to letting all these new fans in, who will discover your work for the first time through these samples?
For De La Soul, I didn't say that because this was stuff that had been out years ago. Yeah. It just wasn't necessarily cleared properly. But, I'm always very transparent and very honest when I'm negotiating with people. So if I have a song with multiple samples, some of which are cleared and some of them which weren't, which I'm then clearing, when I present it, I lay it all out for them like, hey, your sample wasn't cleared. Maybe they didn't realize they had to clear it because it was a drum beat or a hey, hey, or, whatever it was. But there were other songs that were cleared and I only have X percent to work with. And I need to make sure that the guys have something to walk away with. Let's start crunching numbers so we can all come to terms. And people were amazing. People were really understanding and trying to make sure that the guys got a piece of writing and publishing share.
I mean, let's go back to, let's talk about 3 Feet High and Rising, but I guess this applies to a couple of their early albums of De La Soul's. You mentioned earlier that back in, let's say, the late 80s, around the time when this album was being created and published originally, it was around a time where contracts, licensing, and around sampling were in their infancy. You're saying doing things on a handshake or a buyout, which was understandable for that time, right? Because there wasn't this machinery around it. But did that mean that there were any sort of baked-in problems from the perspective of this was agreed back then in this way, and it results in this kind of issue now that makes it difficult to clear it in 2023?
Those are conversations that we're having, because the conversation that people have is, well, streaming rights, they weren't necessarily included because we didn't have streaming. But I always like to argue, when you're clearing something, you're usually doing all audio configurations now known or hereinafter devised. So, but then you have to try to figure out, well, what is that value? Because streaming has a much different value than, say, the value of a hard configuration, meaning CD or vinyl, or, back in the day, we did audio cassette tapes, believe it or not. So, so we have to try to have those conversations to make sure that you're not turning one value into another value that might be too high because it doesn't match how people are paid out for streaming. And so it's about just conversations and negotiations.
I mean, perhaps not specifically for De La Soul, but in general, when you have these conversations about clearing a sample and saying, hey, I've got this great artist has used this great piece of your music. It sounds fantastic. This is what it sounds like. What is the sort of the number one sticking point, if you like? What is what are the most common stumbling blocks in getting it signed off and being able to move on?
Right. So we're talking about contemporary sample clearances, and we're not talking about De La Soul. So there's different parts to it. On the publishing side, we're negotiating just a piece of the copyright and usually a non-recoupable fee. Standard rates today, the publishers usually take about a $2,500 non-recoupable fee plus a piece of the new copyright. On the master side, the labels usually take a recoupable advance, and then there's a group of labels that do a percentage of PPD, plus they define a value for third-party income, and it's usually a percentage of artist net receipts, and that's like for streaming. And then they carve sync out completely, where they say, you do not have synchronization rights. You need to come back for those. Okay. Right. Then there are other labels that do a percentage of gross. They want an advance recoupable against a percentage of gross. So every time we're doing it, it's not even like you've got this cookie cutter equation anymore. You have to look at who the artist is, what label's releasing it, what kind of deal he has. Is he paid gross by the label? Is he paid artist net, all this terminology. We talk to the attorneys, we talk to the label, we talk to the managers. So we know what that equation is, so that when we approach the labels, we make sure that their quote falls into the same equation the way the artist is paid. Artists are paid very differently in 2023 than they were paid in 1990. So, and this is always going to be evolving. And I talk about that with sample clearances. How we even structured sample deals starting from 1990 to now has evolved and kept changing. We did buyouts initially with the labels. Then they were doing advances with rollovers, which meant we would get $3,000 for every 250,000 units. Well, what if they only sold 300,000 units? 50,000 units would have a much greater value than the first 250. That did not work. Then it became a penny rate because, being American, we're like, well, everyone uses pennies. That didn't work. So then it turned into a percentage of the selling price. But then it didn't take into account streaming, reductions, how the artist got paid. And that's what I mean where I say it's always going to evolve. And this also applies to new technology and how I'm now involved with metaverse and NFTs. And people are like, oh my God, this is all new. It's Wild West. I'm like, calm down. Yeah. It's not. Whatever we come up will be a solution today. But as things evolve, we'll have a new solution tomorrow. Sample clearances are the same thing. Even the way we're structuring deals right now, it could change in the next couple of years because of the way the platforms change. Is streaming still going to be around in 5 years? We don't know. Yeah. It could change. The whole idea of downloading MP3s was like the big, we went from CDs to MP3s to streaming. I think we're going to go back and it's going to be, a digital component that you can carry in your wallet.
Yeah. And yes, there's a lot of assumptions made, and I guess they were made back in the late 80s as well about how things would work. And we can see now with De La Soul, for instance, how that didn't pan out, and there's been this big delay. And this historical context, you mentioned hip hop is 50 years old, and according to that definition, and 25 years ago, or a little bit longer, was that fabulous golden age of sampling. And artists then were sort of, I'm saying, playing fast and loose. They were caught up in the excitement of it and sampling this, grabbing that, and putting it together, and it sounded fantastic. There's a sort of assumption, and perhaps justified, that form of sampling is not possible anymore. I mean, De La Soul very famously called their second album, I think, De La Soul is Dead, because it's of the sort of the impact of sample clearances on how they made records. And there was, we haven't really had many records like 3 Feet High and Rising or Paul's Boutique since, because perhaps of the expense. So are we going to see, is it just too expensive to do an album like that now? Or
that's a great question. I don't know how many times people have said to me, sampling is going to decline, or people are going to do interpolations because they just don't have the budgets. And Deborah, how is your business going to survive? Because this is not going to last, Yeah, it has lasted, and it's not going to change. And you've got a new generation, and the equipment is different, where people can just be sitting on their laptops or using their phones to create music and to sample and incorporate other music. So this technique and style is never going to go away, in my opinion. It is an art form, and it's not just hip hop and rap. I worked with U2 in 1996, where they sampled on their album. Michael Jackson sampled. B-52s have sampled. I have country artists that have sampled. So this is not just geared towards hip hop and rap. And we're still not done in getting the proper acknowledgement. I'm not going to necessarily attack any organizations, but sampled writers and sampled artists should be recognized with the new writers and the new artists in award situations. Mm. So we're not done. We're not there yet. We're still on this path of total acceptance of sample clearances, being here, been here, and will continue being here.
What is that sort of persisting allure then of using a sample? Because on one hand, you could say, okay, it makes loads of sense. I'm thinking back to maybe the sort of late 90s form of sampling where P. Diddy or Puff Daddy, as he was then, would take a very recognizable loop of a song and it's not a cover version, but it's so recognizable. It's a sort of almost a remix. But then, so I can sort of understand the allure of that. But then artists today, with, like you say, they have unlimited creative possibilities. They still want to go and grab a piece of a song from the archive. What do you think that appeal is for them as creatives?
Well, I'm not creative, but I'm a music lover. So haven't you ever heard a song and you're like, oh man, that chord progression is awesome. And you just can't get it out of your head, or you hear this drum beat. You know, my partner, my boyfriend, is a drummer. So he drums on everything. And, you know, and you could just hear something that I, a non-drummer, wouldn't even catch. And then I hear him playing and I'm like, yeah, that is an awesome beat. So it's almost like an homage, if you will, where they really love something and then they want to create something new with it. Why did Lin-Manuel take lyrics from hip hop songs and incorporate it in Hamilton? It was an homage because he loved that music and he wanted to incorporate it and do something with it. So there's, you know, it's just kind of like in your everyday life. And then if you're on TikTok and you see what other kids are doing where they're mixing other songs, you're like, oh my God, I can't believe these two songs can mix together so beautifully. So there's nothing wrong with it. I think it's a creative decision, and it's just taking something that you love and creating something completely new with it. Yeah. And people loving it because you recognize something familiar and then you're hearing something new added to it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, from my personal perspective, I've discovered so much music through sampling. You know, where I've heard a sample and then gone and discovered, you know, whole albums off the back of hearing a sample in a Beastie Boys record.
Exactly. That's exciting, isn't it?
Yes,
I mean,
yeah, thrilling.
And, you know, Syl Johnson used to call me and thank me because of RZA sampling him. Hamilton Bohannon, you know, as difficult as he could be, because he was very protective of his copyright, but he was really proud when Justin Timberlake and people sampled his material. So if you think about it, and people can argue and dispute this, but I stand firm where I say it was hip hop and it was sampling that revitalized and brought to life and continues the life of a lot of music that we would have forgotten or never heard. And it deserves a lot more credit than it gets. Yeah. Not just because it's been around for 50 years, but it has lengthened the life of music that many people would have forgotten about had they not sampled it.
We always think about sampling as like, okay, there's the producer and with a sampler or the laptop and making music and releasing it. But then you've got this new paradigm where you have millions of creators using TikTok, sort of mashing songs together. And it's a kind of taking it back to sampling's roots in a way, very crude and mashing things together, speeding things up, slowing things down. Without wanting to sort of wade into the whole licensing around TikTok and the short form video argument, how do you sort of see the future of sampling in that sense, in that user-generated content sense?
I mean, what I usually reach out and say to people is, it's fabulous that you're doing that, but you're doing it to show off your skills as a producer, and therefore you need to get consent and you have to do the right thing. You know, I think that big part of sampling, remixing, interpolating is to make sure that whoever's original copyright you've utilized, that you get permission, they get the credit, and they get compensated. So I'm okay with what people are doing as long as they do the right thing to make sure everyone is okay with it and is financially compensated.
Which makes a lot of sense. I mean, there's a sort of gray area in these emerging platforms, aren't there, where they're providing music and saying, hey, cut it up, do stuff with it, you know, and that's, of course, if I was a 15-year-old kid and I could do that on my iPhone, I would be doing it. You know, it's great fun. So there's a bit of way to go there, isn't there, in terms of how that works, in terms of credit, in terms of making it fit into that bigger picture of who is credited before we even talk about being paid, I guess.
It is a bigger picture. I mean, we have worked on a couple of these artists that were on TikTok that mashed some stuff, you know, almost did mashups, if you will. And they're not easy deals. And there was a major label that got involved to help finance that because it was not easy. It was two big artists coming together and mashed up. But I don't ever want to see creativity being stifled or held back as long as people are given the right advice to clear things properly.
One of the alternative ways that people can use sampling now is online sample libraries where everything's pre-cleared. They've got their place, right? And I can see how people would use those. But you think that people are still going to keep coming back to sampling in that utterly creative sort of crate digging way. And where might it go? Where might sampling go, do you think, as a sort of tool for creativity?
So I'm not a fan of a lot of these online libraries because they don't warn and represent they have the right to grant those rights. So if someone posts a beat of some kind, it might belong to someone else. Right. So we're very wary of those, where we know with Tracklib, at least, it's pre-existing copyrights that have been licensed and therefore can be licensed for sampling. So I am going to say that. I think when it comes to digging in the crates, our generation used to dig for vinyl where people were selling it used on the streets, or we went to record stores. Now YouTube is a great crate for people to dig through to find obscure stuff. So I think people are going to continue down that path of digging in crates and sampling. When people use the library, use these libraries, these free beats or these like $50 beats, sometimes when you Shazam them, you'll get like 10 different songs that come up that's got the same beat to it. So I don't think that's necessarily a solution.
Yeah. Interesting thing you mentioned about YouTube is, and I've done this myself, you go down the rabbit hole on YouTube, you find all this stuff. It is the ultimate, it's the bottomless crate, right, to dig in.
Yeah.
There is music that is on YouTube that is not on streaming platforms. It's, it could be short run 12-inch records from the 80s or early 90s. It's obscure stuff. What happens maybe when someone samples that and it's really hard to trace that back to its source?
It's hard. So, my team, we reach out to a lot of people. A lot of times the writers are deceased. We look for the estates. We look for sons, daughters, grandchildren, people who know people. When you look at, don't forget, songs are like, art or copyright. Just because someone dies or a label becomes obsolete, it doesn't mean it doesn't have value or exist anymore. There's usually people who have bought it, acquired it, or don't even realize they have it. So we sometimes have to go down those holes to look for it. It's almost like we're private investigators.
You're the reverse crate diggers. That sounds kind of exciting as a job. Yeah, that's a fascinating look at what you're doing. Here's a final question for you then. Do you have a favorite piece of music? Just as a little bit of personal context, you've mentioned your sort of love for sampling and that you were a punk originally, but if you could only select one record, whether it's an album or a song, what do you think you'd go for?
I think Kendrick is one of the most talented artists I've ever worked with. And if there's one album that I could bring on an island, it would be, Pimp a Butterfly. I think he is just beyond words the most talented artist out there, most talented contemporary artist.
Right, and you've worked with a bunch of them, so that's a good measuring stick there. Great, thank you. I think you're the first person to mention Kendrick Lamar when I've asked him that, so that's a first. Deborah, thank you ever so much. Really grateful.
It's my pleasure.
And there we are. So if you found that useful, please share this podcast on with someone else who you think might get something out of it. And if you'd like to contact me, you're always welcome to do so. It's joe@musically.com. That's joe@musically.com. We also have a free weekly email called The Knowledge, which rounds up bits and pieces of the best analysis, news, marketing insight, and skills from Music Ally and deposits them in your inbox every Friday. So sign up by the link that is below the podcast, and you'll become a better person. That's it from me this time. I've been Joe Sparrow. Thanks for joining us as ever, and see you soon.